On a late autumn evening, a quiet neighborhood held its breath. Front porches glowed with the ordinary amber of hallway lights. A television murmured behind curtained windows. In one modest home, a family counted the hours and found something missing: a daughter who had always come home. That absence became the first page of a file, the first notation on a whiteboard, the kind of human silence that transforms routine police work into an all-consuming search for answers. This is the story of how investigators moved from that first worried phone call to a tightly bound case file, from witness interviews and evidence logs to a breakthrough that redirected months of labor and eventually led to an arrest. It is not a tale of spectacle. It is, instead, an examination of process, how methodical work, patient reconstruction, and the relentless pursuit of small inconsistencies can produce truth where chaos once stood. Mary Catherine Edwards was known in her town for a dozen small, human things: her laugh that came easily at the right moment, a volunteer shift at a local charity, the way she always brought extra snacks to gatherings. She was a neighbor, a friend, a daughter, ordinary identifiers that became anchors for a community suddenly intent on remembering every detail of a life interrupted. When she didn't answer calls that evening, family members grew uneasy. What began as a late return stretched into a missing night, and then into a missing day. Social media posts asking for information multiplied. Posters went up. A candlelight vigil was arranged in the town square. Those public acts of hope did two important things. They focused attention, and they made the case a community priority. Local residents began to call police with tips, names of cars, recollections of lights on unfamiliar roads, the recollection of a sound in the distance. Each tip, no matter how small, became potential data to be evaluated. From the outset, those handling the investigation understood two realities. First, time favored uncertainty. The first 24 to 72 hours were critical for preserving evidence and validating leads. Second, people remember differently under stress. Memory is malleable. The investigator's job would be to assemble a timeline that could be corroborated across multiple sources to separate the reliable from the incidental. The missing person report arrived at the local police department like so many others through a phone call that formalized the family's worst fears. The dispatcher recorded basic information: last known time and place, physical description, clothing worn, and details of the day. The report triggered established protocols. Officers were dispatched to the family's home, an initial canvass of known locations began, and officers checked nearby hospitals, shelters, and transit hubs. The initial police response prioritized two practical objectives. First, ensure the family's immediate safety, support their needs, and secure the home. Second, collect perishable data, eyewitness accounts, security camera footage, and phone or device information that could degrade quickly. Officers and detectives stood in living rooms gently asking questions. Who did she speak with last? What was she wearing? Where had she been earlier in the day? Those early interviews had a double purpose. They gathered information and established baseline statements that could later be cross-checked. Search teams were organized. Uniformed officers swept nearby neighborhoods while detectives called for any available CCTV from businesses along likely routes. Traffic cameras and private surveillance, doorbell cameras, ATM surveillance were queried. In many investigations, moments captured on camera become the best evidence of movement through space and time. Here, detectives hoped the same would be true. From the first day, investigative leadership stressed documentation. Every call, every video clip, and every note became evidence once logged. Maintaining a meticulous chain of custody is routine language in detective work, but its importance cannot be overstated. A broken chain could render vital evidence unusable in court. Detectives organized the investigation like a puzzle. The frame was the known facts, time last seen, the victim's routines, and each piece would be added through targeted work. They created a timeline spreadsheet that mapped every verified and alleged sighting against phone pings, social media activity, and wallet transactions. Every inconsistency was highlighted. Canvassing was exhaustive and methodical. Teams visited residences, knocked on doors, and showed photographs to anyone who might have seen Mary Catherine. They re-interviewed neighbors multiple times, not to badger, but because memory sometimes clarifies with time or new triggers. Investigators also used cognitive interviewing techniques, gentle prompts that help witnesses recall additional sensory details without implanting false memories. Questions were specific and anchored in everyday touchstones. What scent was in the air? Which direction did the person walk? Were their dogs barking? Parallel to witness work, detectives requested electronic data. Phone records and device metadata can reveal patterns. Cell tower handoffs that indicate movement, timestamps of messages, or sudden shutdowns that can be clues. Investigators sent legal requests where required subpoenas for call detail records, preservation letters to social platforms. Those requests are not arbitrary. They are calibrated to respect privacy laws while retrieving the data necessary to build a timeline. Surveillance footage became a lifeline. Investigators collected hours of grainy images from convenience store cameras, traffic intersections, and private security systems. Analysts scrubbed the footage, looking for consistent markers, clothing, backpacks, vehicles. Multiple independent timestamps allowed detectives to triangulate movement. As they built this visual map, certain witnesses' statements either aligned with or diverged from what the cameras showed. Those divergences often signaled where to probe deeper. Forensic teams were likewise in motion. They processed the home and potential scenes for trace evidence, fibers, fingerprints, and biological material, always careful to record exactly where evidence was collected and how it was handled. Forensic units worked with methodical patience. Unlike the urgency of a public appeal, lab work is meticulous, slow, and governed by protocols that ensure findings can withstand legal scrutiny. Behavioral analysts and victimologists contributed by studying routines and relationships. What was Mary Catherine's state of mind? Did she have ongoing conflicts, recent unusual behavior, or new acquaintances? That context helps identify whether disappearance was voluntary, accidental, or foul play. Investigators interviewed friends and coworkers to map social relationships and note any unusual recent interactions. Throughout, detectives practiced corroboration. Every claim was supported by at least one independent source whenever possible. When the same detail appeared across different mediums, witness testimony, camera footage, or physical evidence, investigators promoted it from anecdote to corroborated fact. A case file is not a single document but a living archive, roomfuls of notes transcribed into digital databases, photographs cataloged, and video clipped into time-stamped segments. Detectives assembled discrete sections, timeline, witness statements, physical evidence, leads that were cross-referenced. The early chaos was slowly ordered into a coherent working theory. One of the critical functions of the case file is to allow investigators to see gaps, moments where no data exists, or where testimonies contradict. Those gaps became targets. Detectives would ask, if Mary Catherine left point A at 9:15 p.m., why is there no confirmed sighting for the next 80 minutes? Could there be an uncollected camera angle? A forgotten receipt? A private security footage that hasn't been requested? Each gap prompted targeted follow-up. Another essential part of building the file involved identifying patterns in the evidence. For instance, seemingly innocuous details, an unfamiliar car seen twice in the area, a specific time when certain shops closed, or an acquaintance whose statements subtly shifted were harvested and examined for consistency. Leads were scored high, medium, or low priority, depending on plausibility and corroboration. Resources were allocated accordingly. Detectives also used digital forensics to examine devices belonging to the victim. Phones, laptops, and social accounts hold a trove of behavioral clues, search histories, recent contacts, calendar entries, and messages. Even deleted data can sometimes be recovered, offering potential revelations about plans or concerns. Analysts reconstructed communication threads and cross-referenced the times messages were sent with camera footage or eyewitness reports. On several occasions, these cross-checks corrected initial assumptions about movements and put pressure on certain timelines. Witness credibility became a repeated theme in the file. Investigators documented not only the content of statements but also their context and consistency across interviews. A neighbor who initially reported seeing a figure matching a description might later recall different clothing, details that must be accurately recorded and evaluated. Detectives learned to balance skepticism with empathy. Inconsistencies did not automatically imply deception. People simply remember differently. One of the less visible but fundamental parts of the file was the record of negative findings. It is as important to show where investigators looked and found nothing as it is to present positive evidence. Those negatives narrow possibilities: roads checked, cameras reviewed, and homes searched. The file grew, and within its pages, a pattern began to emerge, small at first, then clearer. Investigations rarely hinge on a single cinematic moment. More often they turn on the accumulation of small alignments. Yet there are times when a new piece of information crystallizes prior ambiguities into a focused direction. In this case, the breakthrough came when detectives found a convergence between previously disconnected threads. A witness, someone who had been reluctant to come forward, provided a detail that aligned with two separate pieces of evidence already in the file. It was a description of a vehicle parked on a side street at an odd hour, combined with a recollection of a person exiting the vehicle carrying an item later described in other statements. Independently, analysts had already flagged the same vehicle from grainy surveillance and matched its license plate partials to a registered owner who, curiously, gave an inconsistent alibi when first questioned. This triangulation, physical presence, corroborating witness recollection, and a questionable alibi, elevated the vehicle and its owner into a higher priority investigative target. At the same time, digital evidence supported the suspicion. Phone records showed that the suspect's device was in the area at the relevant time and accessed certain services consistent with the timeline. This combination, visual, testimonial, and electronic, allowed detectives to draft probable cause for more intrusive steps, targeted searches, requests for additional data, and focused surveillance. The breakthrough changed the investigation's architecture. What had been an open, time-consuming canvas became a focused effort on one subject. Resources that had been spread thin were now concentrated. Detectives prepared legal request warrants supported by the mosaic of corroborating facts to search vehicles and properties. Every warrant application required careful articulation of probable cause, and investigators prepared affidavits that interwove the corroborating elements: witness statements, surveillance clips, and digital logs. Once the investigation honed in, it moved into a different rhythm. Surveillance teams watched patterns of movement. Forensic units prepared to process new locations quickly. Detectives recalibrated their interviews, now asking targeted questions designed to provoke more precise recollections or to test alibis. Interview strategy shifted from broad canvassing to tactical interviewing. Detectives met with individuals who had peripheral knowledge, seeking to dislodge more detail or to identify contradictions. They used comparative interviews, asking the same questions at different times to check for consistency. Good detectives listen not just for facts but for the spaces between facts, pauses, changes in tone, and evasions that can suggest where to probe next. Investigators also employed corroborative tactics. They rechecked surveillance footage across time windows to see if a suspect's vehicle appeared elsewhere. They used license plate reader data where available to track movement. They queried financial records for unusual purchases, fuel receipts, parking charges, or purchases consistent with proposed movement. Forensic anthropology and trace analysis were used when physical items were found, fibers, soil, or tool marks that could be compared against the suspect's possessions. Coordination became essential. Local detectives worked alongside state investigators and, when necessary, federal agents who could offer specialized forensic capacity or investigative tools. Multi-agency task forces can be politically and logistically complex, but when unified by a clear objective, they expand the investigative reach. Investigators shared evidence, synchronized legal requests, and arranged joint operations to minimize leaks and maintain integrity. Investigative ethics remained central. Detectives understood the burden of proof and the rights of suspects. Consent searches were preferred when available, warrants were sought when not. Throughout, the chain of custody was preserved, every sample labeled, every photograph logged, every transfer recorded to ensure evidence would hold under judicial scrutiny. As the days passed, the suspect's movements were further constrained by cumulative evidence. New interviews placed them near the relevant locations. Forensic tests matched trace evidence to items in their possession. Communications analysis showed repeated contacts at key times. The constellation of evidence, each piece modest on its own, combined into a persuasive whole. Detectives prepared arrest affidavits with care, ensuring the narrative of probable cause was clear, logically ordered, and factually supported. An arrest is a precise moment in a long process and requires meticulous preparation. It is the culmination of probable cause translated into action. When investigators believed they had the necessary assurance, they executed an arrest warrant. The operation was planned to secure the suspect and preserve evidence while ensuring officer and public safety. The arrest itself was swift, and professional officers approached with command and restraint, read rights, and took custody. Evidence seized pursuant to warrants was catalogued, and suspects were transported for processing. The immediate days following arrest are critical for preserving the case's integrity. Interrogation records, post-arrest statements, and the processing of physical evidence must all comply with constitutional protections and evidentiary rules. The legal timeline that follows an arrest is governed by statute and precedent: arraignment, pretrial motions, discovery, possible plea negotiations, and, if necessary, trial. Prosecutors evaluated the evidence assembled by detectives, the chain of custody of forensic materials, the clarity of witness statements, and the digital corroboration, and decided whether to file formal charges. Charging decisions prioritize both the strength of evidence and expectations of justice. Prosecutors must assess whether evidence will likely secure a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. In some cases, defendants plead guilty as part of plea agreements, exchanging a fuller accounting of facts or cooperation for reduced charges or sentencing concessions. In others, cases proceed to trial, where the evidentiary record is tested in open court. Trials are not merely theatrical, they are procedural crucibles where the reliability of each piece of evidence is examined by adversarial counsel and subjected to jury scrutiny. Throughout legal proceedings, investigators often support prosecutors preparing witness testimony, explaining forensic methodologies, and reconstructing timelines for the record. Their role transitions from evidence gatherer to witness. They must communicate findings clearly, explain technical processes, and withstand cross-examination aimed at exposing weaknesses. Regardless of the courtroom outcome, conviction, acquittal, or plea, the process itself is not an endpoint for the family. Justice, in law, follows rules. Closure in the human sense follows time, support, and the ability to rehearse memory without daily speculation. Investigative teams frequently remain involved after trials, assisting victims' families with questions and pointing them toward community resources. The emotional and social work of recovery begins alongside, and sometimes independently of, the legal resolution. The aftermath of such a case reverberates through a community. Neighborhoods that once felt safe reconsider late nights. Families adapt to new routines and memories. Local law enforcement reviews protocol and often absorbs lessons about evidence preservation, interagency cooperation, or the management of community tips. For investigators, the case file is archived but never forgotten. Each missing person case informs the next. New standards for data preservation, improved engagement with social media, better coordination with private security camera networks, and more thoughtful community outreach. Detectives often revise checklists and training modules based on what worked and what did not. For the victim's family, the resolution, legal or otherwise, is layered. Accountability does not erase pain. Still, the methodical work of investigation can provide a structure for grief, a record that shows people cared, looked, and sought the truth. Families often speak of the importance of being heard, of knowing that their concerns were treated with rigor, not dismissed. That, for many, is as meaningful as the legal outcome. Investigations also shape public perception of policing and justice. Transparent communication without compromising active leads builds trust. Communities that see methodical, careful detective work are more likely to support ongoing efforts. Conversely, rushed conclusions or mishandled evidence can fuel suspicion and erode confidence. The discovery of truth in cases like this happens through patient accumulation, the quiet logs of interviews, the long hours spent scrubbing footage, the lab reports with cautious language, and the single witness who finally feels safe enough to share a memory. Investigative work is an exercise in humility. Detectives must accept the initial limits of knowledge and be willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads. They must balance urgency with procedure, compassion with skepticism, and the demands of public interest with respect for legal rights. When those balances are struck well, the case file becomes more than a collection of evidence. It becomes an artifact of civic responsibility, a chronicle that honors the victim by pursuing truth, not sensation. Remembering Mary Catherine Edwards means keeping the person at the center, her life measured not by the headlines that followed it, but by the relationships she nurtured, the routines she loved, and the unresolved questions that inspired so many to seek answers. The investigators' work, careful, patient, and exacting, was their contribution to that remembrance. A procedural, human attempt to restore order to chaos and to give the victim and her family the dignity of a thorough, accountable search for justice. If there is a closing thought, it is this: justice is not a single moment. It is the sum of many small acts, calls returned, evidence logged, interviews conducted with empathy, and the steadfast refusal to let a case go cold. In those acts, communities and investigators together keep the memory of those they have lost both alive and honored.